Sure.
You don't have to.
I don't have laptop.
Yeah.
Yeah. But today I'm presenting on a cornerstone of my dissertation and also a fundamental chapter within one of my new books that are being published in the fall with Paul Grave Macmillan. Indeed. The title of this, well, actually I've got a working title, but the title of the book from which it's drawn is entitled The God of Chance and Purpose. The God of Chance and Purpose. And this is the introductory chapter to it. And it kind of gives an outline of where the book is going and so forth. Although I don't say chapter 3, chapter 4 and stuff like that. I have it in various other sections instead. Nevertheless, I will begin by noting that Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, of course, insisted that a perfect universe must have an element of chance within it in order to allow humans their autonomy. In the present paper, I will agree with Aquinas and argue, in fact, that randomness is genuine in the universe. Randomness is genuine in the universe. In fact, I'm going to label such genuine randomness randomity. Randomity. Indeed. God does not determine the outcome of every scientifically random event, but instead controls randomness by setting broad boundaries, such as the range of possible outcomes of a random event, and then also sets probability values for each outcome. Now, this is a more supervenient role than an executive or a, I guess you could say, what's the word? What's the Greek word I'm looking for there? No, I'll come back to that. But it's more of an executive role than a direct causation. Regardless, God then allows particles, systems, and even organisms to interact according to natural laws within those boundaries, those broad boundaries. According to natural laws, I do assert, according to natural laws. That's important. Producing thereby a wide range of beautiful and complex results. So then, we live in a world of randomness and of order and of chance. But how much is truly random? This essay explores how, through a paleontological examination, randomness and chance, which are inextricably linked, shape the world from the very bottom up. While I appreciate Sweetman's distinction between chance and randomness, this essay will essentially collapse the two together, in so much as I'm using randomness and chance as essentially synonymous terms. Essentially synonymous terms. Indeed. The phenomenon known as convergence, which this paper also explicates with reference to dagger-like canines in animals and several examples of the multiple convergences in camera-like and compound eyes in insects and other animals, indicates that evolution through natural selection may proceed along various paths, yet the destinations are few. So then, there is a definite dichotomy. Randomness is constrained within pattern. Constraint in evolution is central in determining what might never be possible against what is very likely to be possible, perhaps even inevitable. In fact, Conway Morris, one of the key architects behind convergence theory, which is what this paragraph explicates, or elucidates rather, I should say, Conway Morris contends that when one looks at either the functionality of biological solutions or the roads taken in evolution, the choices that organisms and other entities have are indeed restricted, if not inevitable. Convergence theory is important because it is central to the study of evolution due to its confirmation of the power of strict adaptation acting upon historical contingencies. Adaptation and historical contingencies shape the world as we know it. Historical contingencies, which I've expounded upon before in a presentation I've given before you at a prior date. Nevertheless, note that the radical, or rather, it brings into focus, this convergence theory that is, brings into focus the tension that is present within the rule of organization for any entity and the radical contingency of historical pathways in the paleontological record. Convergence, that is when, allow me to unpack that word a little bit here. Convergence is when you have something akin to, or akin, I should say. Good. I see. I'm a slow buck, but I do learn from time to time.
You publish books, Brad. Don't cut yourself. We have questions.
Keep those later. Keep those for later. Okay, mark them, and keep them until later because I want to keep going here. Right. But regardless, convergence theory. Let me illustrate this on the board if you don't mind. Back over here on the board. Convergence theory. Is there a marker anywhere? Uh-oh. Well, there's not. But, yeah.
Just keep it going. Yeah. Oh, you got one?
Yeah. Convergence theory indicates the entity X and entity Y are widely disparate organisms coming from distinct evolutionary lines. For example, I'm just making this up here, so I'm shooting from the hip, and it may not be exactly apropos, but again, I'm shooting from the hip, so just go with me. Here you have let's just say a toad, and then you've got an antelope. The antelope and the toad have an entirely different evolutionary history. We can think of that, correct? Although, at a certain point in their life history, because the toad and the antelope share a common environment, that leads them to display certain characteristics. Now, it does not cause those characteristics because that would go against fundamental biological theory. Because, of course, the environment cannot cause mutations, although once a mutation arises, the environment can select for it and then therefore amplify it in the next generation, correct? You follow me? So here's this environment, a common environment. Let's say, I'm shooting from the hip and just making this up entirely. A common environment of a lake. Well, this toad is going to evolve over successive generations. This toad is going to evolve. I'm thinking here particularly of when people get older, how their skin starts to become crepey, I guess you could say, and kind of hang, especially from their arms and so forth. Well, they develop those on their legs and in between their proverbial hip and their legs because it enables them to swim better. You follow me?
Oh, like web.
Like almost like a webbed feet, but webbed. I guess you could say like webbed legs and webbed hips, and so to speak. Indeed, webbedness. Yes. So they develop webbedness, and then this antelope. Again, I'm making this up. Now, I know of no real antelope who has a webbed nature, but so I'm making this up. But just go with me for the purpose of illustration. The antelope also, because they're in this common environment, somewhere along the line, antelope number 1,060 million, in the generation developed by chance mutation, this particular webbedness on their toe, between their toes, which enabled them to swim better in the lake. Okay, again, this is foolish, but just go with me because I don't have anything in my mind right now that's actually apropos. So here we have a convergence of webbedness of their extremities. That's a convergence. That's what convergence theory says. That convergence theory indicates that entities or organisms, or even, I like entities better because it's ambiguous, entities from disparate evolutionary lines over the course of evolution itself develop characteristics that are common amongst them. It's a convergence of phenotypic expression. Does that make sense better?
Last word?
So you mean like,
Phenotypic expression.
so you mean like, okay, real quick, I know we can't ask questions, but
Yeah.
say there are two animals, two organisms in a common environment, so they're getting common pressures.
Right.
So like two totally unrelated species swinging through the trees, they
Right.
have stereoscopic vision.
Mhm.
They're unrelated, but because they're in this common environment,
Right.
over time, there's pressures and their eyes develop in a certain way that
Right.
help them
In so,
swing through the trees.
in so much as over time, there, to use your example, the camera-like eye, they
As you mentioned that.
they come to possess will be very, very similar to one another, even though they're from different species, totally different species. But you'll see, to use the camera-like eye, which I'll get into later. Of course, you've got camera-like eyes in squid, and squid are nothing like humans, but we have camera-like eyes as well. But squid have an amazing sense of vision to be as low on the evolutionary pole as they are, if that makes sense. I'm using high and low there in the sense of advancement in terms of their complexity and so forth. But with that aside, do we have an understanding of what convergence of Conway-Morris refers to? Convergence. Conway-Morris asserts that convergence is ubiquitous across the scale of life. I'm here on the middle of page 3, I do believe. Although the number of possibilities in evolution is more than astronomical, the ones that actually work, the possibilities are astronomical. Randomness, mutation, you can never exhaust the possibilities. And mathematically, well, I guess mathematically you technically could, but in practicality you would never exhaust the actual, variations possible. But in actuality, only a small subset of that great astronomical figure that's possible actually work. They're actually practical. Okay? Small subset of the potential number. Convergence theory opens up new ways to picture evolution by natural selection. That's my first thesis. But in order to understand the events and generalities of life's pathway, we must go beyond the principles of basic evolutionary theory to a paleontological examination of the contingent pattern of life's history on the planet Earth, which is the single actualized version among millions of plausible and possible alternatives that did not occur. I mean, we every day are learning the expanse of our galaxy. And even beyond that of the universe, and even beyond that, if you subscribe to such a speculative theory, the multiverse. I mean, the possibilities are endless. Truly, it is. Multiverse, and it's something I don't want to get into now, but there's good evidence to project or to posit that there could be such a thing as a multiverse, and I'll leave it at that for right now. Such a view of the history of life is highly contrary to the conventional deterministic methods and models of Western science, and to the deepest social traditions in the Western Hemisphere that argues for a life history that culminates in humans as their most magnificent expression, as life's most magnificent expression. Indeed it does. In its magnum opus, The Structure of Evolutionary Theory, Stephen Jay Gould emphasizes the importance of recognizing both the reality of structural constraint and the idea that structures have historical origins. In so doing, he helps unite insights from both sides of the age-old debate between functionalist and formalist biologists. Functionalist biologists generally indicate that variations arise because they have utility. They have functions, hence the term functionalist biology. The functionalists, indeed, such as Darwin and Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, typically stressed that features of organisms existed for utilitarian reasons, that is, they were adaptations to their environments. And formalists, on the contrary, such as Etienne, Jeffrey St. Hilaire, and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe.
Good.
I'm telling you, I do learn from you. They typically stressed the structural unity of type across similar organisms. A formalist, for example, often denied the possibility of evolution because they believed and asserted that only superficial change, not fundamental change, could occur and therefore was possible. The division was permanently undermined between formalist and functionalist biologists by the great one, Charles Darwin. I almost said the great one, Mark Levin, but anyway, the great one, Charles Darwin. It was permanently undermined by him when he showed that structures had evolved naturally through natural selection. Although after their emergence, these structures may indeed constrain the evolutionary pathways available to organisms thereafter. So then, they arise by chance, but then they constrain thereafter. Does that make sense to us all? Can we understand that distinction there? Very well then. In doing this, Darwin fundamentally reoriented the functionalist versus formalist debate by adding a new dimension to the functional, that is active adaptation, and formal or constraints of nature dichotomy. He added succinctly historical contingencies, meaning that all the things that happened were not necessarily foreordained, nor were they foreseen or foreseeable. They were contingent upon life's oh crap moments, so to speak. Do you understand what I mean?
Oh crap, you did.
Right. But I mean, we understand what I mean by that, I hope. Indeed. Indeed, oh crap. Right. But
That's a term of art.
it's a term of art. Indeed. Three features of the paleontological record stand out in opposition to the conventional view of the history of life as broadly predictable processes of gradually advancing complexity through time. For example, and firstly, the constancy of modal complexity argues against the broad predictability of life's advancement in complexity through time. Secondly, the concentration of major events in short bursts, geologically speaking. And when I say short bursts, I'm talking hundreds of millions of years. But that's, of course, a lot. That's minuscule in comparison to the totality of life on Earth of about 4.6, 4.7, almost 4.7 billion years. And then even beyond that, our galactic history, at least our galaxy history, of about, 13.7 billion years. Right. I mean, these numbers are astronomical, but mathematics works out that way. Indeed. I'm not going to get into the various problems with regard to, or the various potential problems with regard to dating the universe and the history of our life at that level, but there are obviously some there. But nevertheless, the concentration of major events in short bursts interspersed with long periods of stability likewise argues against the idea that life's progress and complexity through history is broadly predictable. Again, the short burst, I've referred to this before as, this is known as punctuated equilibrium. Punc-eq, I'll abbreviate it. Punc-eq. Here, I'll put it graphically for you. Here you have modal complexity at zero, net zero. This is, of course, y, that's your x graph. Intersection, here we have modal complexity of zero. This apparently would have been, of course, the Big Bang, correct? Follow me? Modal complexity is zero. Punctuated equilibrium stipulates that complexity hovers around in stability for immense periods of time. And then all of a sudden, geologically speaking, has advancements in complexity. You follow me? Mm-hmm. If I can draw better. And then it does not return to its basal level, but kind of bottoms out a little bit above that.
Indeed.
Okay, and then it goes through a period of other basal nothingness, you could say, in a sense, just I guess sort of a wishing to and fro with variable, what she said, with variation not really amounting to anything, just natural variation. But then all of a sudden it has another jump in complexity, which goes higher than the previous peak. Do you follow me there, graphically there? Excuse my lack of drawing skills, but nevertheless, you should be able to get behind or get my point from this. And when it troughs, it's the basal complexity of that level is still yet a little higher of the previous punctuation, which is still higher than the first punctuation. Do you follow me? And then from this washing to and fro, you have another emergence of punctuations, and then so forth on down the line until you reach the current apex equals Homo sapiens, which is, of course, our particular subspecies, Homo sapiens sapiens. Right, and of course, you could place on this graph. You could say this might be Homo erectus, this might be I don't know, a rodent. I'm just shooting from the hip here, and this might be say something aquatic eukaryote, which is of course a single, I should say, a multi-celled organism, and then this would be your bacteria, and then here at the basal level you have something like archaebacteria, which if you break that term down, you can understand what it means, archaebacteria. We now contend that archaebacteria were the first primitive forms of life. They were generally anaerobic, living in deep thermal vents, deep hydrothermal vents, I should say, in the ocean, and they were often also known as extremophiles, because as you go lower in the ocean, it gets hotter than hell, frankly, right? It gets very hot, especially when you get near the hydrothermal vents. But yet these organisms can withstand temperatures up to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. And that would totally boil. I mean, literally, that would boil most organisms that we think of. But these archaea still live there in the extreme temperatures. They still live there. We project that at the beginning of life, that's where they occurred, at these hydrothermal vents, because you've got a system far from equilibrium, far also from stability, and as we know, mutations and other adaptations and so forth increase in frequency and also success in extreme environments. So, and I can go into a multitude of other questions, or a multitude of other explanations, but that's not the purpose of this essay. I just wanted to give you a little background there with that. Nevertheless, the final thing that gives that gives pause to the broadly predictable process of gradually advancing complexity through time is known as mass extinctions. Mass extinctions. There have been typically depending upon your authority, there have been at least 8 mass extinctions in life's history on Earth over the 4.6 billion years that we contend that Earth has arisen, or that life has arisen on Earth. 8 mass extinctions, and if I had a better memory, I could dictate which ones were which, but I don't. Nevertheless, know it to be true that I will use the most typical example of a mass extinction, and that, of course, is the one that we all know about with regard to some flying object, some big flying object coming through our atmosphere, and it was big enough to where it did not disintegrate in our atmosphere, or maybe our atmosphere was not as well developed at that time. I'm not, that's a theoretical question, a speculative question, but regardless, some sort of flying object from outer space, if you will, or from the solar system, impacted our Earth. And that's what, of course, did away with things such as dinosaurs and other ichthyopods and things such as that. We all know about that. That was the Jurassic era. Well, that enabled the quote-unquote Cambrian explosion. The Cambrian explosion. That Cambrian explosion was a punctuation, a definite gap in complexity, a definite gain of complexity. Things such as that, these three things, the history of modal complexity, the concentration of major events in short bursts of time, punctuations, and then thirdly, mass extinctions, totally reorient the gradualistic view of evolution. And as we all know, we were probably taught in high school that evolution does not proceed by jumps, right? And that's a very common statement. I wish I could attribute it to who said it, but nevertheless, I'll think of it by the time I get through. No jumps. Evolution does not proceed by jumps. Rather, if we reconstruct that same y and x axis, the conventional model of evolution is a gradually ascending value on the x and y axis, and you have various organisms that are all interconnected by linkages known as transitional forms, right? Well, that theory is riddled with problems because for the last 200 years we've been able to find about this many transitional forms, right? I mean, that's a little excessive there, but you get the point. Comparatively speaking, we've got a vast fossil record, a vast paleontological record, but the transitional forms are few and far between. And hence, in view of those three things, people such as Stephen Jay Gould says, wait a minute, guys, we've got to think of a new paradigm here. And that's where the punctuated equilibrium comes into play. Because that accurately depicts what we see in our fossil record. That accurately depicts what we see in our fossil record. Very well. The God of chance. According to Gould, the history of life is not progressive per se or necessarily, and it's certainly not predictable. The Earth's biota has evolved through a series of fortuitous. Homo sapiens, for example, did not appear on Earth in one glorious moment of time. Rather, humans arose as a contingent outcome of thousands of interlinked events, any one of which could have occurred differently and thereby led evolution on a different pathway. Indeed. I'll illustrate that by a quick diagram as well. Please bear with me. I enjoy visual aids. But the contention that evolution could go down different pathways can be represented by a branching tree here. Okay, and here we have, let's personify evolution. Evolution is working toward upward in the tree. Well, let's say here that this contingent event knocks off this branch. So evolution itself, personified again, goes in a different direction, ends up going this way. Or a branch goes this way. This branch gets closed off and it goes this way. Do you follow what I'm saying there? Contingent events that did not need to happen could totally redirect the angle or the trajectory of evolution. Indeed it could. Thousands of linked events, any one of which could have turned out differently and thereby led evolutionary history in a different pathway altogether. We could have, in fact, I mean, it's imaginable that we all could still be aquatic animals. Because we, of course, emerged from the sea, and then to the sea did we return. Well, the people left on land, continued to complexify and adapt and of course, grow in complexity and so forth. But it very well could be the case, like our whale brethren, who are mammals, of course, and there are a handful of other mammals, but that's a very poignant case. They're mammals in the sea. that indicates to us that they develop their viviparity or some of their mammalian characteristics on Earth and then return to the sea.
Really?
Indeed. That's the only explanation. They return to the sea. To mention just 4 examples among many, if one member of our chordate phylum, those that have a backbone, chordates, if one member of our chordate phylum, that is, of course, a branch of our evolutionary tree, that is Pichia, which shows its relation to us by its possession of a notochord, which is, again, the basal instrumentation of a backbone and of a spinal cord, if you will, to put it in human terms. If they had not been among the survivors of the initial radiation of multicellular life in the Cambrian explosion era, circa 520 million years ago, then it is unlikely that vertebrates would ever have inhabited the earth at all. This one individual species, Pichia, they're that important. If they had not survived the impact of whatever hit us and whatever killed us, and not us, but whatever cut off life prior to the Cambrian explosion, if they had not survived, it's unlikely that humans would have arisen at all. But if something akin to humans had arisen, there would be vertebrates, if that makes sense to you. Indeed. Secondly, another example. If a small group of lobed, finned fishes had not evolved with a radically different limb skeleton with a strong central axis perpendicular to the body, that is thereby capable of bearing weight upon land, then vertebrates would never have possibly have become terrestrial out of the sea before our movement back to the sea. If a meteorite had not struck the earth circa 65 million years ago, then dinosaurs would probably still be dominant in today's world, and we would be living within dinosaurs' world, not vice versa. They would probably be the dominant species, and just bluntly, right, not us. Further, fourthly, if a small lineage of primates had not evolved upright posture on the African savannas just 2 million some odd years ago, then our ancestry might never had evolved to have walking capabilities, and our ancestry might have ended up being a group of ecologically marginal apes. But this small subset of small lineage of primates evolved the ability to walk upright, and then from that, of course, developed the pelvic girdle, or arose rather the pelvic girdle and upright posture, and then that enabled, of course, such fine motor control, fine motor control, and so forth like that. Right, but regardless, we are an item of evolutionary history, and not an embodiment of general evolutionary principles. We are the embodiment of evolutionary history, not principles. We're an item of the history. Toward the end of the 20th century, Stephen Jay Gould published Wonderful Life, The Burgess Shell and the Nature of History, which is perhaps the most successful book on a paleontological subject since Darwin's The Origin of Species. Although seemingly an account historically of the discovery of the Burgess Shell in vertebrates, which are found high in the Canadian Rockies, Gould nevertheless uses the book to advance a number of claims about the very nature of evolution. According to him, Charles Doolittle Walcott, and I love that name, Charles Doolittle Walcott, all right, misinterpreted, he's actually a famous paleontologist, let me spit it out correctly. Yeah, of a different era, but nevertheless a well-renowned paleontologist of a different era. Gould claims that Walcott greatly misinterpreted the fossils that he first found in the Burgess Shell in 1909, early 20th century, due in large part because of his conventional view of life that insisted that evolution was an upward bound trajectory. You follow what I'm saying there? He misinterpreted. He allowed his theory to direct his interpretation of facts, not vice versa. That's a common error for all practicing biologists, and even for those who don't work in biology but then try to read biology. They allow their presuppositions to form the interpretation of data, not let the data inform their presuppositions. That's putting the cart before the horse and so forth like that. But because he insisted that evolution was marked by a steady progressional rise of complexity. But Wonderful Life, that is Stephen Jay Gould's book, promotes the notion that Walcott committed a cardinal error by shoehorning, that is forcing, that is making them fit into a pattern, making the Burgess shell fauna fit into existing phyla and classes instead of allowing them to speak for themselves. So in other words, here we have a man who found these unique organisms, but instead of allowing them to speak for themselves and develop a new category, no. He said, I'm going to put them into an existing category. So he forced the evidence into his preconceived notion. And that stunted, to a large degree, evolutionary history, evolutionary understanding for 50, 60 years, thereabout. Walcott's interpretations of the Burgess fauna remained uncontested for more than 50 years until a group spearheaded by Henry Whittington at Cambridge University in 1971 published a monograph that not only re-examined Walcott's conclusions, but also radically reinterpreted the Burgess shell fauna, and with it the view of life in general, even our own evolution in particular. Wonderful Life, that is Gould's book, recounts the reinterpretation of the Burgess shell fauna and the ideas that emerged from this work by Whittington's group. 3 paleontologists rule the roost, so to speak. They have center stage in Wonderful Life, as they did most of the grunt work, the technical work, in anatomical description and taxonomic placement. That is, the aforementioned Henry Whittington, the world's leading experts on trilobites, which we've all heard about, I'm sure, at some point in our life, trilobites, as well as the 2 men who began their careers as understudies of Whittington, and then built their career on the Burgess shell fauna. That is Derek Briggs, who is a famous paleontologist in his own right, although he's not as famous as Stephen Jay Gould, but nevertheless he does a lot of hard scientific work, whereas Gould popularized things, but regardless. And Simon Conway Morris, who we've already ran into earlier in the paper. Gould employs the fossils of the Burgess shell to further his arguments for the importance of historical contingency relative to natural selection and adaptation in the history of life. Indeed, Gould makes 3 primary arguments. First, rather than the cone of increasing complexity, which he indicates is the primary iconography, very well. Iconography of evolution, that is the primary understanding, I guess you could say, or the primary thought behind evolution. Rather, the Burgess shell fauna supports a model of rapid increase in morphological disparity, not a gradual increase in morphological disparity. In other words, instead of saying that here, graphically, instead of saying that life arose to a higher level of complexity here, Gould says the higher level of disparity was right here at the origin. And then there was a whittling away in time. The high morphological disparity was actually prior to the derivation of complexity, or at least the derivation of humans, you could say. Indeed. Gould avers that, see, you taught me that too.
You're right.
I'm telling you, I mean, you have to understand that. I learn words by reading the dictionary, not by hearing them.
Yeah, no, I hear you.
So anyway.
Life has meaning.
Right, indeed. He avers that the familiar accounts of evolution are meant only to reinforce a comfortable worldview of human inevitability and superiority, arrived at after a long ladder of progress. Again, that gradual increase of complexity of which humans are the pinnacle. But Gould contends instead of that life is a copiously, and I quote here, life is a copiously branching bush, continually pruned by the grim reaper of extinction, not a ladder of predictable progress. So then, in Gould's view, evolutionary innovation was primarily focused in the events of the Cambrian explosion, with later history after the Cambrian explosion largely generating endless variations based upon the basic types, or the basic, I'm using type there in the sense of typology, typos, of course, being derived from Latin and Greek, that being the form, or even loosely connected to morphe, in a sense. But regardless, he says that with later history, generally endlessly produced variants on the few surviving models, the types, if you will. He refers to this pattern as decimation because he can combine the literal and vernacular senses of the term to suggest the two cardinal aspects stressed throughout the book: the largely random sources of survival and death and the high probability of extinction. I'll note here as an aside that decimation comes from the Latin decimare, which literally means to take 1 in 10. To take 1 in 10. What did that refer to? Well, it referred to the idea that in antiquity, whenever someone would I want to make sure that I get this right. Whenever someone, regardless, when people were accused of mutiny, they would randomly select 1 out of 10 to survive and kill the rest. Indeed. Randomly, if like I think I'm extrapolating this correctly, but if a whole company, and using a modern vernacular term, of soldiers went astray, they would randomly select 1 out of that whole company, or 1 out of 10, and kill the rest, and leave that 1 out of 10, and leave a tenth. It's a decimate, indeed, decimate. Gould suspects that in the great majority of cases, the traits that enhance survival during an extinction period of time do so incidentally and are not related to the causes of their evolution in the first place. While animals evolve their sizes, shapes, and morphologies under natural selection during normal times and for specific reasons, when a mass extinction comes about, what may have been advantageous prior to the mass extinction may be disadvantageous after it. Do you see what I mean by that? Indeed. So animals may evolve their sizes and shapes and so forth, but after a mass extinction event, the environment has changed so fundamentally that what may have been of use before the mass extinction event may be a hindrance or even a negative after the mass extinction event, because the environment has changed so fundamentally by that event. He asserts that there can be no causal correlation in principle between the derivation of a trait in that circumstance and its new usage. After all, a species cannot evolve structures with a view to their potential usefulness millions of years down the road. With regard to randomness, or what I refer to as randomity, Gould notes that, I've already covered that, and I did in fact properly elucidate that, because if you read down further there at the bottom of that page, it goes on to speak about mutiny and how 1 in 10 would survive and so forth. So then, applying that idea of decimate or decimate to the probability of extinction, Gould points out that decimate connotes that how most, if not, say, 90% of all individual entities in the Burgess fauna, or the Burgess shale. Fauna is just simply a technical word, for species, if you will. Species, rather. Say 90% of those individual entities in the Burgess fauna were extinguished without leaving any significant lineage. Stereotypy, here's a word that Gould coined, stereotypy, which he uses to refer to the cramming of most species into a few anatomical plans, is the mark of modern life forms. Think about it. There are only a handfuls of models or of morphes upon which life, as we know it today, is seen. I mean, you've got a general animal type, you have a fish type, and you have and so forth. Like, I mean, you could there are only a handful of different body plan types, and that's referred to as stereotypy. Gould contends that after the Cambrian explosion, after the Cambrian decimation, rather, or that which preceded the Cambrian explosion, something happened, of course, a meteorite or some sort of event happened astrologically, which caused all of human life, all of life, to be crammed into just a few successful morphological forms that happened to emerge out of that ruination. Do you follow me? Hope you do. The model of maximal increase in morphologic disparity early in the history of life leads to a second major argument of wonderful life, which is Gould's thought experiment of replaying the tape of life over again. The Burgess pattern of decimation shows that groups may prevail or die for reasons that are not related to their Darwinian selection fitness. Again, entities or lineages may survive with no relation at all to their inherent fitness, that is, their ability to reproduce and produce and produce and produce in order to extend their lineage. Fitness there is a very biologically focused word. It doesn't mean physical fitness like we use it today. It means sexual reproduction, perpetuation, and product, and so forth like that, indeed. This leads Gould to stipulate that if it were possible to replay the tape of life over again, to proverbially back it up in the VCR and then hit play again and let things happen again, that the outcome would certainly be almost certainly be different, both in detail and in general. Replay the tape of evolution and you don't get the same thing twice. You don't end up with Homo sapiens sapiens. That's his radical assertion. And I agree with it fully. We are a contingent instance of thousands of interlinked occurrences that could have turned out differently. I find that compelling. And I find that compelling biologically, and also find that compelling theologically. Indeed I do. Because it indicates that God can work as a craftsman through whatever may arise. And it also highlights his inherent creativity as well as his empowering amoripotent love, to use my word there, amoripotent. Indeed. Gould goes on to say that any replay of the tape of life would lead evolution down a pathway radically different from the road taken actually. But the consequent differences in outcome do not imply that evolution is useless, senseless, and without meaningful pattern. Rather, the divergent route of the replay would be just as interpretable after the fact, and just as explainable after the fact as well, as the actual road that was taken. But the diversity of possible itineraries does demonstrate that the eventual results cannot be predicted at the onset, or at the outset. Each step proceeds for a cause. He's not saying there's no causality in the universe. He's not saying that things happen without cause. He's not saying that at all. He's saying things do happen due to a cause, but they're contingent causes, and we can't know them. That's not good English, but I hope you understand what I mean by it. We cannot know them prior to them occurring. Can't know them prior to them occurring. Each step proceeds for a cause, but no finality can be specified at the start, and none would even occur a second time in the same way, because any pathway proceeds through thousands of improbable stages that could have turned out differently. Alter any early event, ever so slightly, and without apparent importance at the time, and evolution cascades. I love that. Evolution cascades into a radically different channel. Think of playing billiards at the billiard hall. What happens when you miscue? You can at times hit the 8 ball into the corner pocket, but usually, if you miscue, if you hit the 8 ball at all, you're going to hit it at an angle in which causes it to go erratically and not the direction you want it to go. That's essentially what he's saying here. That in fact, if we alter any event ever so slightly, the trajectory of evolution would cascade in a totally different direction. It's all contingent. For Gould, this is the essence of contingency. Occurrences in the history of macroevolution just happened. They were not necessary, certainly not predictable, and every one of them could have turned out differently. In fact, a number of other possible events may have happened in their stead. Importantly, Gould is keen to highlight that each event has its own cause, to reiterate, but these causes were not necessary. In postulating this, both Gould and I differ from Sweetman, who notes, seemingly, that by indicating that the contingency in history and the history of life, we're asserting that mutation has no cause. But that's totally specious argument. And I won't deride on it any longer. Gould's third argument in Wonderful Life builds upon the patterns of disparity and the import of contingency to conclude that natural selection and adaptation play a less significant role in evolution than acknowledged by most evolutionary biologists. That's key. Ever since Darwin, we have elevated natural selection and adaptation to be primary in the forces of evolution. That's what we're all taught in school. That's what we're all taught in college. Gould says, nigh. Indeed. He says, instead, he says that contingency is more important. We do not know why most of the early experiments in evolution were failures, which they were. We project that almost 98% of all species that have ever existed are now extinct. That's significant. That's radical. That has direct implications into our view of God, does it not? Why would God create a universe if he had total control and if he had total predictability? Why would he create a universe in which 98% of all entities within it would go extinct? It makes no sense. It makes no sense. We have to fundamentally change our view and our conception of God's controlling or uncontrolling or more potent love. Period. Indeed.
We'll discuss that.
Indeed we will. I figure we will.
People are sharper than their knives.
Come on at me. Yeah. It's tempting to say that the victors won by virtue of their greater complexity, better fitness, or some other predictable feature of the conventional Darwinian struggle. But nothing, here's a key point, nothing in particular unites the victors of the evolutionary experiment. Therefore, a radical alternative must be considered, that each early experiment in evolution received little more than a proverbial ticket to the biggest lottery ever played on Earth. A proverbial ticket to the biggest lottery ever played on Earth. I love his imagery here. This is one reason why Gould is such a popular writer, even though he's a hardcore scientist. Well, he has graphic imagination. Well, he did. He's now dead, died in 2002, but regardless. Yeah. The transforming power of the bird's message can be seen in its affirmation of the history of life as the chief determinant of life's direction. And it shows that the fantastic explosion of early disparity is followed by decimation, largely based in terms of what one can picture as a lottery. Gould concedes that the origin of life on Earth was virtually inevitable. That's the key point. Life would have risen anyway, just not this way. Life would have arisen anyway, just not this way. You understand what I mean by that? Excellent. All right then. Ideal. While the laws of nature impact the general forms and functions of organisms, the channels are so broad so as to leave the details to chance. The physical The physical channels, so to speak, of life do not specify arthropods, annelids, mollusks, and vertebrates, but at most bilaterally symmetrical organisms based upon repeated parts. In fact, Gould elsewhere says, I suspect that given the composition of the early atmosphere and of oceans, that life's origin was a chemical necessity. Contingency rises later when historical origin enters the picture of evolution. Much less do physical channels specify the essential answers related to our own origin, such as why mammals evolved, why primates moved from land to trees, and why the fragile lineage of Homo sapiens emerged and survived out of Africa. This evidence suggests that God, this is my point here, this evidence suggests that God does not determine the outcome of every scientifically random event, but instead controls randomness by setting broad boundaries within which natural law can work out the way it wishes, the way it wills, if you will. Natural law, natural causation, and so forth can work within those broad boundaries. God thereafter allows organisms to interact according to biological laws and thereby produce a broad range or a wide range of beautiful and complex results. God of Purpose, Part 3. Perhaps the most sustained critique of Gould's contingency argument has come from Simon Conway Morris, who is a teacher at Cambridge. I've already covered convergence to a great degree, so I'm not going to cover it all. But I will note that Conway Morris's most famous book is called Life's Solution. Life's Solution. In that book, the central theme depends upon the realities of evolutionary convergence. That is, the recurrent tendency of biological organization to arrive at the same solution to a particular need. Again, if you think back to my first graph, what have you, regarding that crazy example of the antelope and the toad both getting webbed feet, so that they can swim better in lakes. Again, that's totally absurd, but I'm shooting from the hip here. Convergence tells us at least two things, according to Conway Morris: that evolutionary trends are real, and that adaptation is not some occasional component in the organic machine. It's not some occasional cog in the wheel of organic evolution. Rather, it is central to the explanation of the derivation of life. Conway Morris gives examples from predator-prey relationships of the dagger-like canines in placental cats, as well as South American marsupials known as the thylacosmilla. Right, that word. You can find that, I think, on page 9 or 12. Anyway, he presents evidence that suggests that even with the placental cats, the saber-tooth habit evolved at least 3 times. And he goes on to list the various organisms that I can't pronounce either. Indeed. I'm going to skip down. Not only are the dagger-like canines convergent in animals, but also other features in nature. For example, cats see through the dilated pupils of its camera eyes, whereas mosquitoes see through compound eyes. Not only have these two types of eyes, camera and compound, evolved several times, but even the neural architecture underlying that compound and camera-like eyes evolved numerous times, which is also a strong indication of convergence. You can read through that if you so desire. I'm going to skip ahead because of time. Indeed, I'm not going to focus on all the details regarding convergence. I want to get into my conclusion because I want to hear your reaction to my poorly presented paper. So what does the preceding analysis of Gould and Conway Morris's postulates mean for those of us who insist upon a God of relational, a more potent, and uncontrolling love. I suggest two things. First, there is ontological randomness, or what I have termed randomness, in nature. God uses this randomness in order to populate the world maximally by maintaining dynamic equilibria in complex systems. But this ontological randomness does not preclude the derivation of propensities toward the expression of similar form, that is convergence. Even though this ontological randomness is everywhere apparent in the world, convergence is still a reality. Even though things are random, things still converge upon similar phenotypes because they're in similar environments. Do you follow what I mean by that, sir? June? Indeed. Excellent. Even among widely disparate evolutionary lines. These findings strengthen the case that mechanical optimization can drive evolution, contributing to the long-standing debate over the evolutionary roles of randomness versus physical constraints that limit the solutions that are feasible in living creatures. In sum, quantifying physical properties that underlie biological phenomena could help us recognize when an optimal mechanical solution is likely to drive convergent evolution, I contend. Again, so this suggests that there is a God of purpose behind it all, wooing, luring, if you will, creation forward in complexity, convergently, even in the midst of random, even despite of the everywhere apparent randomness, as I term it, in the universe. God is nevertheless there, luring from the future, luring us toward our eschatological fulfillment and complexity. Thank you for listening.
So, I guess my question is, so we blow ourselves to smithereens and the human race is no longer.
Okay.
Is that God luring us to fulfillment? I guess I'm trying to place what you're saying in the context of reality, particularly as it relates to human beings. And within the reality of human beings, there are wars, among other things. Okay. There's the development of weapons of mass destruction.
That's a very anthropocentric way to look at things. Very anthropocentric. Who is to say that humans, as we know them, are the penultimate or even the ultimate expressions of God's desires for the universe, of God's desires for the world being, of course, our earthly existence?
Well, okay, in making my comments, I'm also trying to integrate biblical tradition. Okay. So God created man in his image. So, I mean, the whole biblical, let's just stick with the Christian and Hebrew tradition. There's something special about man who is made in God's image.
Do you realize how much of a studied and fought over term or phrase God's image is? It's historically been placed into the context of rationality, but it could be morality. People have argued for morality, rationality. They've argued for higher level critical thinking and so forth. I mean, I'm drawing a blank here, but nevertheless, God's image is not a static thing. God's image, if indeed we had gone down a different evolutionary trajectory and different evolutionary line, I contend that God would have saved whatever that product would have been, and we would have been made in God's image. Because we're not made in God's image from the start. from the rear. We're made in God's image by being fulfilled in Christ. When Christ would have come and saved us if we had all been rodents.
Well, I think I'm trying to integrate what your presentation with biblical tradition, right?
Okay.
To integrate the theology with the biological and theory, so to speak. So it is true that I guess, if God is still in control in some sense, whatever exists may have a purpose in mind from God for its existence.
I belie that entire inquiry there. God does not control others. A loving God cannot control others. A maximally loving God cannot control others. It goes against.
What do you mean by that? Because parents control their children,
right?
For example.
They're not maximally loving though.
Well, maybe they're controlling them because they're maximally loving, because children don't.
But we're not children.
Not to walk across the street and get hit by a car.
We're not children though.
No, but I'm just, okay, well, let's let somebody else ask a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, I was just gonna say, I had a question, not quite along that line, but more in a more abstract sense in terms of the method, like what exactly is going on in here. And it does seem that on the one hand, there's this very specific, rich understanding of the process of evolution,
right.
And you're pointing at a different way of looking at evolution from what most of us have learned,
right.
which focuses on, there's mutations and chance, but it's basically regularity, adaptation. And the Gould, if I understood you correctly, the Gould discussion, what he brings in different ways is the openness of it, contingency of it, and really downplays the law, part of this. And it made me think of, now we haven't mentioned God at all.
Right.
And this is where I have a question of how how this is functioning to sort of open up or raise some question about our thinking about God, how exactly that's happening. And it struck me that randomness, indeterminacy, chance, normally we think of these things as, I guess, we want order, we want to be able to predict, we want to be able to control, whatever. But what you're saying, and what Gould is saying, is that this is something positive. And it reminded me of even people who talk about divine action at the quantum level. They always look at the where indeterminacy is. That's where the open door is.
Purportedly, until it gets slammed shut by science in 3 or 5 or 10 years from now, then we're going to be worse off for the wise, right? But
my question just is
the whole problem with the divine action debate.
Yeah, I don't have a clear question, but I'm kind of like John is bringing up that there's a biblical tradition that speaks of God in a certain way, and of course that's open to many interpretations too. But you're bringing two discourses together in some sense. Which can be powerful, but I'm kind of groping, trying to get a handle on how I would get into this sort of thing, how, because it's interesting even without talking about God. And then Gould, of course, I think Gould was an atheist.
Gould is a Jewish atheist. He is.
Okay,
yes.
so what would he think of your reading of his?
Gould is a unique atheist. He was not a militant atheist. He was more of an intellectual atheist. In appropriating his concepts, I'm not looking to do violence to them. I'm letting them lie the way, not lie, but lie as in, lie the way, lie where they fall. Exactly right. Not in any way trying to distort them at all. I appropriate his concepts, and then I add in a layer on top of that, which I did not get to fully develop in this particular paper as of yet, but nevertheless, in my larger project.
Because this is part of your dissertation.
This is part of my dissertation, right? This is part of my larger project, right? In which I lay out that the God of a more potent, uncontrolling, and responsive love cannot control other entities by default. Because control is antithetical to love, it's my assertion. Okay, insisting upon control is antithetical to love. So God then uses chance, randomness, and randomity, as well as indeterminacy, as you referenced there before, in order to maximize the complexity in the universe, and also in order to maximize the disparity in the universe, the differentiation, variance, you could say, variations and variance with a C, indeed. And the only way I contend scientifically to get a high degree of differentiation and complexity in both in terms of number as well as in terms of substance, complexity in terms of number and substance, having different organisms but also having differently complex organisms, is to have those systems be random and chance-based. Not to be driven by any law, not to be driven by any physical law and so forth, but genuine ontological randomness. But nevertheless, God, and this is where I'm going to make the constructive argument that God lies ever before us, wooing us, luring us to the eschatological fulfillment that we will have in Christ. Now, this is not a backwards to forward movement. It's rather a forward to present movement. It's known in theology as prolepsis, based upon the Greek word, which I cannot pronounce correctly, but transliterated as prolepsis. And it forms the foundation of Wolfhard Pannenberg's, my to-be Dr. Votter's Dr. Votter. Right, so I've got a grandparental lineage there, right? Well, nevertheless, it forms the foundation of Pannenberg's system of thought, prolepsis. That is the inbreaking of the kingdom of God eschatologically upon the present today, influencing the present today and the past of yesterday in order to bring it to fulfillment toward the reality that God desires it to be, which is a fully complex, in my interpretation, in my appropriation of Pannenberg and of other people as well, complexity, diversity, as well as disparity.
Is there anything Trinitarian about because you talked about, I think I asked you this question before in your earlier presentations. You talk about God, but is there anything Trinitarian or diversified in terms of persons in God?
Pannenberg's God is Trinitarian.
Pannenberg's God is definitely Trinitarian. I mean, you're right, right. My God, I focus a great deal on pneumatology. Focus a great deal on pneumatology because pneumatology is less particularized than Christology and even patrology in that sense, right? Because not every, but all the theistic religions have their own view of God, have their own Savior, if you will, have their own mediator. So they're all particularized. But the Spirit, it crosses boundaries. So I like speaking of the Spirit, therefore, because it's less particularized. So
would this be different because you do use the word God in here, like if you talked about the Spirit instead of God? I mean, it just...
Right. Well, I developed that elsewhere in my corpus. I do. Right.
Yeah.
Right. And this
I
is...
think we've talked about this.
We haven't talked about this before, right? But it's an excellent question, though. You're right. I should probably make this more consistent with my other works, but this is something that I'm still refining and so forth, right? But that's an excellent suggestion, right? It is. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I liked it quite a bit. I followed all the science, I think,
yeah.
And I do agree with Good a lot more than the slow adaptation.
Right.
I've often seen punctuated equilibrium more as like a renaming of a problem than an answer, but I may not know as much in that sense. So I'm wondering exactly toward the end when you say that this suggests that God exists and is working. And particularly,
I don't think I assert that God exists per se. That's a fundamental presumption on my part. As in, I take that as a starting value. I'm to say that this suggests that God exists would be a natural theological enterprise. Natural theology is a dead thing, dead. It still goes today under various guises, but the historical classical conception of natural theology is a dead enterprise. That being that we could prove God from nature, that nature leads to God. I think that's spurious and even specious.
Okay. So then, when you're using words, because we're sort of departing from one Christian tradition. When you're describing God as craftsman, or God uses this phenomenologically or just conceptually, what does that mean? And then is there any phenomenological compellingness to it? What compels, if we could put it this way, one to move from Group's atheism to your perspective? What would that's sort of my curiosity.
Interesting. Well, of course, I come from an atheistic background, right? After my action, I went through periods of anger. In 1995, I was pissed off at the world, everybody in general, and you in particular. I didn't know you then, but I was pissed off at you in general, or in particular, I should say. Right. Just everybody.
He didn't know, but he had an accident when he was 17.
Right. But anyway, I moved through four or so years of atheism. And then during which I studied my foundational biology programs and so forth, and started making things that God didn't make, so to speak, in the laboratory for emergent genetics and so forth. But nevertheless, I then converted to Christianity, and I wanted to redeem my biological past. I wanted to make inroads into my biological past, reading the data of biology in a consistent manner with theology, not trying to lead one from the other or from one to the next or from the next to the one in reverse fashion, but rather to read it consistently. So that's my motivation behind making that movement. I'm not sure if I adequately addressed your question, but if you could hone in on what you mean by phenomenologically.
Right, how would you or I guess I'm always interested in how would you compel others, because you had a phenomenological experience to say, oh, now I believe in this divine something.
Right.
And then you try to sort of, I forget exactly how you say, parallel it with the understanding of biology.
Okay.
Yeah, what was the compelling nature to do that? In your phenomenological,
in my experience,
or whichever way you want to go.
Okay, sure. Well, in my experience, my desire, my compulsion, my compelling, if you will, is the intersection of biology and theology, because biology is the sine qua non, if I say that correctly. Sine qua non. See,
that's pretty good.
Right. It's the sine qua non of ultimate explanation in the world today. Period. Exclamation point. Start new sentence. Full stop. So forth. In so much as no longer are things looked at through the eyes of faith. Things are looked at through the eyes of science. Well, since you presumably have then an opposition of science with faith, are the twain never to meet? I contend that the twain can meet if both receive revision and reinterpretation and reappropriation. Indeed. So that's my compulsion behind my theological project, is getting the two sides to talk to each other in a creative mutual interaction. Did I adequately address your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, sir, you.
Yeah, so I also went to Methodist school for my college, and it was also very heavily influenced by process theology.
Okay.
And then this is very process
Wow,
theology.
yeah, oh, he is processing.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah,
You
for
leave us,
example,
Grant?
yeah, my.
You don't wanna ask a question before you go?
Oh, no, I have to learn, unfortunately. I enjoyed it very much, and it's a bit over my head, but I enjoyed it.
Well, kind of like your Frege paper last week was over my head, right?
Yeah, he's there's only 3 people in the world who understand his dissertation. And he's one of them, and the two other people in that committee, one of them.
That's funny.
Brad described your proposal to Ingolf.
Oh, boy.
He said, dense.
Right.
Did Ingolf say that?
No.
No, I said
Brad.
that.
Ingolf said,
He said something quite.
did you tell him that Grant was doing Frege?
Yeah, I think I did,
Um,
but I wasn't part of this
And he said,
conversation.
he asked us, how was the Frege proposal? Because I think Ingolf really wants to be in this group.
Yeah.
And he just won't admit it. And Brad said, dance.
Email me if you have any questions. I'm sorry that I went on so long. Email those to me. I'd love to hear from
Thank
you.
you very much.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye, Grant. Yes, sir. Now, you were saying that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we had only 3 majors, and then each major had process theologians.
Mhm.
So, anyways, but my knowledge is still in the level, undergrad level, so forgive my ignorance. But so, in order to understand your argument, what is the difference between your argument and deism?
And deism.
Yeah, to clarify, that's the first question.
That's a very good question there, right?
Yeah, and then my second question is, what do you call, how do you define divine or divinity? Because, I mean, as far as I know, when I read Whitehead's The Function of Reason, which is a very short book, he redefines reason, and then there's some kind of elan vital power or some kind of
creativity.
creativity. That is, he reclaim it as a reason, and that is something divine.
Right.
So, I mean, like you said, punctual equilibrium, variable, or spark moment of evolution.
Right.
Is that something divine in your understanding?
Is that something divine? No, it is not.
Yeah,
No,
so,
no,
sir.
no. Although I could make an argument, and I may end up doing this, I'm not sure, that God's proverbial hand, again, to use the anthropomorphic imagery there, if you want to personify God, which, again, making God into our own image is probably a heresy in and of itself, but God's proverbial hand could be supervening upon the process of the emergence or of the punctuations, of the punctuations within the equilibrium, and thereby orchestrating. I like this here. I like that idea of orchestration, because when you orchestrate something, you may be telling people what to do, but you don't cause it. Right? You're not hitting the billiard ball, making the billiard ball hit the 8 ball. You're not doing something. You're merely directing.
You set it into motion.
You set it into motion.
So is that like a deistic thing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I'm honest there. I want to claim more than mere deism, but I've not yet fully reached the point to where I can.
That's on.
But I want a more personal God than that. But I don't know how to get there yet.
Okay, so
They're trying to get there through the Lord potente. Sorry, Jim, go.
So, and then my just personal question is that what is the different evolutionary point between material world and life, like evolutionary biology life, Can you say, usually, there is a material world first. And
So you're talking
material world,
about
right?
material world.
Yeah,
Material.
and then there is life.
Okay, right.
Like, so that we can study biology,
Mhm.
biological life.
Right.
And then there's only material things.
Yeah.
Okay,
They
right.
are quite different, So what is the point?
So you're saying
material
that
world
that-
and then biological life or world. Because as far as I understand, this is also important point to investigate more about prostate theology or biology or scientific theology because you got to connect the material world as well as evolutionary biological theories. I think in order to explain further.
Right. Well, I'm going to address this through the work of my Dr. Walter de Bie, his life's work, that being emergence theory. I contend, and it's as does he, of course, because I've been formed by him over the last decade and a half, I guess, thereabout, but yeah, roughly. Anyway, even before I met him, I met him in person. I met him through his books. I love how we can all meet people through their books, right? But it's an aside, but regardless.
We're talking about Philip here, right?
Philip Clayton, right, exactly. His construct of emergence theory, his philosophical construct of emergence theory allows for a bridge to explain the movement from mere materiality, from mere matter, to mentality, to complexity. Now, emergence indicates that this this pool of this collocation of atoms there, I probably didn't pronounce it.
Yes, you did. That was beautiful.
Okay, right. But
Collocation of atoms. Say that a lot.
Right, but anyway, this puddle of atoms, they reach a point of complexity by which thereafter they emerge into something new. Now, the emergence has continuity with that which came before it. Of course, all things have a material basis, I contend, and as does Philip. So matter then would be the foundation of all biological life. But biological life emerged out of a gradual complexification over that punctuated period of time. Not gradual in the sense of one A plus B plus C plus D, but gradual in the sense of duration, precisely. Will you be there when I defend my dissertation?
Because according to your logic, life, so-called like a life or what kind of evolution, whatever, they should also grow from material world randomly. Right. So that's why I asked.
Yeah, right.
Because but there's a huge gap. Even in evolution and even in material world and life or evolution, so that people try to find some kind of connection there to understand. So, I was just curious.
Okay. Did I answer your question at all, or? I'm thinking that what you're asking is how do you get from matter to mind, or how do you get from matter to how do you get matter to matter, so to speak, right?
Sure.
To use a play on words there, but regardless, I contend that over the course of much time and environmental pressures, random mutation, without the intervention of God, matter becomes complexified. And then, over even more eons of time, matter produces, ultimately, mentality through the processes of emergence. Here I stand. I can do no more to invoke Luther. Yes, sir.
So, given the title, I'd like if you could just say a bit more about God and purpose in the sense of maybe traditional concepts of afterlife, the importance of a human being at all as opposed to an animal. Any ideas you have there?
I'm in process of that, so to speak, because scientifically speaking, we're all either going to burn in a proverbial hell of immolation on Earth if we persist that long, because of course the universe is going to either freeze or fry.
Well, that's not quick. That's not the same thing as the kind of hell that we always
Right. Well, yeah. Right. Well, so and that's hard. That's freezing or frying is very hard to I guess work into God's plan, right? But that's the general. That's the general option that we have before us that science says we have today. Either we're going to collapse on ourselves and the universe is going out to collapse on itself and burn, immolate, you could say. Immolation, or it's going to expand forever and then therefore just simply die of freezing, right? So how does that fit into what you asked me? Well, what purpose? How could God's purposes be fulfilled in such a scenario? Well, this is where, again, I go to philosophy for help. Particularly, in my instance, the philosophy of Whitehead. Because Whitehead taught that we may not persist forever in a bodily or in a mental state, but we could I guess, exist forever in the memory of God, in the mentality of God. And that would be salvation.
Okay, I have another question. It all feeds in the memory of God. So who is Bradford's God? Who and what is Bradford's God? It's a follow-up
Boy,
to
you're being
virtually every question that has been
And I have questions
asked.
after that, I just want to say that.
So kind of unpack, because I'm not sure whether Bradford's God is a personal God.
I've sort of addressed that question earlier because I want a personal God, but I can't get there yet. My
You converted to Christianity, but then you kind of pulled it all back, and you're like, now I need for it to be proven.
Right. Well, I preached the personalist God for almost 6.5 years, I guess it was, and so forth. Right? I mean, I know what Christianity believes, but I don't think I'm there anymore.
All right.
I'm still a Christian, and I got to mass daily. I mean, I believe in the Catholic Church. You look at the creeds. I fully assent to them. Now, how I work them into my biology is a different question. How I work them into practicality is another question altogether, and that's where I have struggles, right? But I believe in the God of heaven and earth.
May I ask my question?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, I have a few questions. My burning question is, when did you coin the word amore potent? This is very important to me.
Probably 2017.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Why do you ask?
I'm not going to explain.
No, please
That would
do.
ruin my theory. Okay. Okay, my second question is, do you have, did God start it all? That's my version of it.
Did God start it all?
That's my more potent. God started it. Probably didn't read far enough in my paper for theories the other morning to say that my last section was about this idea of God started it, which is how I was trying to put a new spin on this claim of traditional theology that you get it, God does everything first. You can't even, if you buy into a traditional creed of the way salvation happens for us, you can't even say that you yourself are responsible for accepting that message. You're kind of required to say, I couldn't have even accepted it without God, and I was talking about it as God started it. So I want to know if you think that God started it. Did God set it in motion? That is a deist idea.
Right. I mean, it is. I'm willing to say that the God in His orchestration. Let me put it to you this way: if we have to use that damnable term, divine action, and if we have to use that at all, and I say it's damnable because it's is necessarily correlated with the insistence upon a causal joint. And every time we insist upon a causal joint, like I said earlier, science 1, 3, 5, 10 years later closes it down, and then we're left off worse for the wise.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and we see this today in the latest instantiation, or one of the latest instantiations in information theory. You know, that God could input information into systems and then thereby influence systems, and that's going to be destroyed soon too. But you know, anyway, did God start it all? Did God start it all? I contend that if we use divine action whatsoever at all, that God could be seen to act at the instantiation of the universe.
Whoa.
Yes, right. I mean,
everything else is going to come out of that one. According to some people I know.
Right.
So that's going to be interesting for me to watch you develop your ideas along those lines.
Right.
Because you could say, and I don't know if Philip does or Whitehead or if anybody in process does. I don't really know anything about process, so I'm just guessing. One could say, well, there is a God, you know, such as we call God, but God just kind of standing on the outside watching it happen, and God never started it all, you know, and that's different. That's why I asked you that question.
That's different.
Okay, so here's, go ahead.
So
My
go
third question.
follow up.
But I don't want to interrupt. what
No.
you're saying.
It is different, right? I mean, I contend that God did have intentions. To use a psychologically anthropomorphic term, desires, motivations for communion with another, communion with another, and other, not another, but an other, and other, which would be in the image of God, which would be akin to Him. Okay, meaning would be rational, would be have a mind, indeed, have the ability to interact, have the ability to know about God, to yearn for God, to yearn for Him, you know, to love Him, to desire Him in the erotic way, you know, to pursue and desire Him, and I think that we see an instantiation of that desire and of that longing in the actual age, which we're going to study 2 days from now.
Yeah, we are.
Right, in
So
England.
that's pretty far along the road.
What are you studying in 2 days from now?
In theories of religion, the axial age.
Okay.
Okay, so here's my third question, which is connected because it's your paper, but not totally connected to what we're talking about right now. First, I want to say I like the ideas about causality that you were throwing out there, especially the one I noted was causality is, but you can't identify it until after it happens.
Right.
That's kind of Nietzschean. Nietzsche has a lot of ideas about that, so I just wanted to tip you off to that. But my question is, or my reflection is, and I want to know what you think about this, it was back in the punk-eek part of your presentation, because this is the second time we've watched you do that graph for us, the punk-eek graph,
Right.
that refutes that idea of gradualness.
Right.
And so what I want to know is, and I don't know how far along the development of your idea about the being of God is, but what I want to know is, if this is really the case, does it have implications for the structure of being?
Are we using being in the sense of that we identified last week in Dalford's class?
I don't know. How did he identify it in that class?
He indicated, did he not, that being was that from which all of the things derive.
Yeah, I think, I'll tell you where my mind was going with that.
Okay.
It was...
Yeah, because being...
I was analogizing.
Is that being with a capital B, with a lowercase b?
Or Ingolf to explain being, and so it's like, oh, it means too many things, you know. But I think that's pretty close to what I'm thinking of. But where my mind went when you were drawing on the board is, oh, that's biology. Oh, I get it. That's evolution. Is it possible that there's more to it than just... There's a larger application to the way that structure seems to work. If we can read that structure, can we read it into other processes in life and
Yeah.
thought and,
Yeah, I
do,
mean,
what, do what Hegel would have done.
I think the McKenna, in fact, used that punctuated equilibrium model, as you just called it, in order to interpret the history of the history of history, history of literature.
History.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
You think that?
No.
Yeah, because I was simply thinking, well, is that how I have experienced even certain developments in my life?
In your life,
like
right.
that, so.
I
kinda
think
interesting to think about.
it's applicable. I really
Yeah.
do. Right. I mean, I find that I grow in spurts. Right?
Right.
I mean, intellectually and even physically, I grew in spurts. Right? As probably we always do. So you could transfer that idea of punctuated equilibrium into other areas, and you could, right? Because, like I said, I grew spiritually, mentally,
Yeah,
and
that's
physically
the
in
thing,
spurts. Yeah.
And then I just wrote at the end of my note about that, does it ever go the other way? And then you answered it right away. Mass extinctions,
Yeah.
Cambrian explosion.
Mm-hmm.
And I wouldn't say you lost me there, but it gets a lot more complex
Right.
at that point. Yeah, and that's part of your big question mark about the what of God.
Right.
So we don't need to go there, but anyway, those are my comments.
Cool. Saskia, you got anything to say to me?
No.
Throw me a question.
I had a similar question like Marlene and you did have.
Okay. All right then. Well, if no one else has anything to say, I thank you for enduring.
We have a lot of things to say, but we realize,
Time is finite.
yeah, there is such a thing as the time to.
Yeah. What time is it anyway?
It's 5:25.
5:25. I've kept y'all here 25 minutes late. I'm sorry. Yeah.
It's too bad you can't eat with us.
Yeah.
I'll tell you the
Usually
truth.
about this time, Brad's like, I'm hungry.
I'm hungry.
It's an emergency.
Yeah. Having a prior engagement tonight, though. Right.
Thank
So-
you, Brad. You're wonderful.
Before y'all leave, someone called me when I was taping this on the phone. It vibrated. But whenever people call, it interrupts the recording. Does anyone know how to splice together two disparate or two separate recordings? Can you do that on a Mac, or can you do that on the iPhone? Can you splice those two together to make them one coherent one?
Not me.
Yeah. Do you know how to do
By
that?
splice, you mean overlay them so you?
No,
can-
not overly.
Disconnect them.
Just connecting them together. Like 13 minutes into the conversation, somebody called me, so I had to hit record again. So is there any way? So I've got two different files there. So is there any way for me to put those two files together into the first 10 minutes and 13 seconds, and then the next hour and 14 minutes and 53 seconds?
There's some kind of app in your Mac, as far as I know, so that you can just connect it.
Okay.
So,
Right there.
Okay,
because you want to combine two different files.